In 1775, Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet stating that the freedoms of man can only be maintained by limiting the power of government. The pamphlet was called Common Sense. In 2015, it still is Common Sense.
I'm Mark Zaccaria.
And I'm Elizabeth Smith, and this is Common Sense. Welcome back, Mark. Representative Patricia Morgan will conduct an extended interview with former Woonsocket Mayor Leo Fontaine. Leo has plenty to share with us regarding the downside risks of binding arbitration for public school teachers. Jeffrey Shard will join us for some talk about online dating. And as always, we will ask and re-ask our favorite question, are you kidding me? But we start with analysis of some of Rhode Island's top news stories. Mark?
Thanks, Liz. Rhode Islanders have just gotten an early look at the next state budget. The version passed by House Finance did show significant teamwork had taken place between the legislature and the administration. That was one of the few bright spots, however. Overall spending is going up, right along with the projected deficit. The budget bill contains the necessary approval language for the pension reform lawsuit settlement. As a practical matter, that means the entire spending package is immune from gubernatorial veto or even significant modifications. No provisions were ultimately made for raising funds for roadway and bridge infrastructure following the rapid demise of the governor's proposal to further tax commercial vehicles to do so. It is all but certain that the revenue from gasoline tax and DMV fees originally raised for that purpose will not be diverted back from its current use in the general fund, so the potholes and unsafe bridges will be cause for the state to look the other way for at least one more year. It also appears that lawmakers will again ignore the 2007 statute requiring any excess income to the state over the original annual estimate to be added to the pension fund. This year, that means foregoing another $13.8 million in principal, even as pensioners are complaining about the cuts they'll face after approval of the settlement. There were increases in the cigarette tax, the taxes on tourist lodgings, and more than a $2 million bump in spending for the perennially broke Rhode Island Public Transit Authority. In the end, though, despite the fanfare and the hopes that a new broom would sweep clean, it was business as usual on Smith Hill for the upcoming budget. Folks, that's just not good enough anymore. Liz?
Well, it's lifestyles of the rich and now infamous. According to the Providence Journal, a federal judge on Thursday, June 11th, sentenced the contrite and fallen former House Speaker Gordon Fox to 3 years in prison for accepting a $52,500 bribe and stealing $109,000 in campaign contributions. In sentencing Fox, who once ranked as arguably the most powerful politician in Rhode Island, U.S. District Court Judge Mary M. Lisi accepted the terms of a plea agreement reached between Fox, his lawyer, and former House Speaker William J. Murphy, and state and federal prosecutors. The longtime Eastside Democrat in March pleaded guilty to bribery, wire fraud, and tax evasion. This week, U.S. Attorney Dulce Donovan had this to say, quote, "To say that Fox's crimes undermine the public's confidence in their elected officials is an understatement. The citizens of Rhode Island deserve better, and the defendant deserves to go to jail for a lengthy prison term. A sentence of 36 months incarceration is needed to deter other elected offices from selling their public officials for personal gain and using their campaign funds to live beyond their means." Unquote. With the door slamming behind the infamous Mr. Fox, will anything going forward really change? Is this the final page of the corruption state diary of egregious behavior? Well, we at Common Sense certainly hope so, but doubt it. Mark?
Liz, the firefighters' unions are hard at work in the legislature trying to muscle bills into law that would overturn a recent Rhode Island Supreme Court ruling. That decision affirmed the management rights of the union workers' the management workers' employers. That is, the cities and towns of the Ocean State. In North Kingstown, where the court case began, town manager Mike Embry reports that $1 million in savings per year after the NKFD was reorganized into 3 platoons. That approach to the 24/7 service of fire departments is actually a standard nationwide. The savings come primarily from overtime pay, which can be controlled much more efficiently under the new plan. Since the savings come right out of the firefighters' pockets, it is little wonder that they are fighting to keep the status quo. If the bills currently before the General Assembly are passed, though, there will be nothing cities and towns can legally do to control costs in their fire departments. That's a real sovereignty issue for the property taxpayers. Homeowners around the states are reminded of what happened when Coventry fire districts just raised taxes each year to cover lavish budget overruns and then went bankrupt anyways. At recent House Labor Committee hearings on these bills, activist Ken Block articulated some of the problems with ceding all management authority to firefighters. Block was not shy about equating financial meltdown with the safety of communities affected.
Central Coventry, and Lonsdale. These failing and failed fire districts are living examples that our fire cost structure isn't working, and it threatens the safety of our citizens. The fiscal emergencies in these places should be a wake-up call. Why are you considering inserting yourselves where you don't belong by considering dictating overtime policy around cities and towns? And why are you
also tried to remind legislators of their proper roles in all this? He emphasized that responsibility of the General Assembly is to be an agent of benefit for all Rhode Islanders, not just those in the big red trucks.
Do you believe it's your job to pass a law that would make Rhode Island firefighters among the most highly compensated firefighters in the country? If you pass this bill, that is in effect what you will be doing. Your job should be to provide ways to save money to Rhode Island cities and towns, not to take those tools away.
In the end, the House committee reported the bill out to the floor for consideration. There it is expected that Speaker Nicholas Mattiello will look down on the chamber from his throne high above it and slowly show the thumbs up signal and to the gladiators below. At airtime, similar action was expected in the Rhode Island Senate. So our last hope of retaining any management rights for our cities and towns lies with the governor. Care to wager on what she will do, Liz?
I have no idea. Well, the Triple Excel now qualifies you to be a top campaign staffer. This according to Go Local Prov. Quote, former Olympic skater and wife of Rhode Island gubernatorial candidate Clay Pell, Michelle Kwan, has joined the Clinton campaign as a paid staffer. According to the New York Times, Kwan will work out of the campaign's New York office and focus on directing campaign circuits to engage voters on issues critical to working families. In 2009, Kwan was named a public advocacy envoy by the U.S. State Department. The five-time world championship figure skater and two-time Olympic medalist has previously worked with President Obama's administration, Vice President Joe Biden, and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And, of course, we all remember her husband's loss in the 2014 Democratic primary for governor. Earlier this year, she was named to the Boston Olympic Committee's Board of Directors, the effort to bring the 2024 Olympics to Boston. Unquote. While I applaud her Olympic medals and figure skating victories, my question is this. What does she know about politics? And how can she align herself with a candidate that lives in a sea of delusional hypocrisy? She seems to be under the Democrats' spell. On related notes, Hillary Clinton held a fundraiser last week in East Greenwich. A bizarre sound was heard outside the venue. Not sure if that was the sound of gnashing teeth from surrounding neighbors or crickets. Mark?
Thanks, Liz. Now for an in-depth look at another employer-employee relationship run amok in Rhode Island. We go to Representative Patricia Morgan. This week, Pat interviews former Woonsocket Mayor Leo Fontaine. Rep. Morgan?
Because high school students get to post-secondary programs unable to read or do basic math, their graduation rates are terrible. But now the Rhode Island State House has the answer. There ought to be a law. Are you kidding me? Here comes another feel-good measure that accomplishes nothing, but does cost us a lot of tax dollars we don't have. It is House Bill 5077, Sub A, and its authors are Reps. McNamara, Azanaro, Diaz, Bennett, and Malik. The legislation requires the State Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to compile statistics of just how bad the remedial education problem is at state-funded 2- and 4-year colleges. The law will require HEW to collect information on race, family income, first and second languages, and high school attendance records. And then the law requires the bureaucrats at Smith Hill to use this data to create strategies that will improve college prep, college enrollment, and college completion numbers, especially non-traditional students. Is that code? No punishments are prescribed for the busy bureaucrats should they fail to answer this question, which has been bedeviling sociologists nationwide for years. So with no downside risk that they won't answer it, they will, however, spend precious labor hours away from their primary duties to create a written report that no one will read, which is just as well, because it wouldn't help anyway. And the pundits wonder where state operating deficits come from. Are you kidding me?
What do I stand for? What do I stand for? Most nights I don't know anymore.
Welcome to Common Sense. This is a program where we try to make sense out of the policies that affect your lives and come up with common sense solutions. And today we have with us Leo Fontaine, former mayor of the city of Woonsocket, a longtime town council president there. Welcome.
Welcome. Thanks for having me.
Well,
Appreciate
thank
it.
you for coming.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure.
We're going to be talking about compulsory arbitration today. I know a lot of people also call that binding arbitration for good reason, but I like the term compulsory because it is.
Yeah.
It's forced upon cities and towns. But Leo, from your experience with it, will you tell our viewers what compulsory arbitration is?
Sure. Well, it's a statutorily imposed requirement upon cities and towns as they're negotiating with public safety unions, whether it be police or fire, that within their processes, if you reach impasse on any issues, they have the ability to take it to arbitration. And in public safety circumstances, according to the statute, those decisions by the arbitrators become binding on the city and town. There's no legal recourse of any real measure.
So, all right, so once the arbitrator comes forward with their decision, you're stuck with it, whether it's good for the taxpayers or not.
Absolutely. And I can tell you, over the years that I was on the city council, most of the contracts that came out of the public safety negotiations were contracts that were laid out by the arbitrator. The administration at the time of the union came to impasse. They turned the entire contract over to the arbitrator, and the arbitrator went through, worked out the details, gave the contract back to the city, and said, "There's your contract." And it was forced upon us, and that's really, I
was
think,
more generous than you wanted it to be.
Well, it always is, and I think that's where you start getting into the problems of compulsory arbitration, is that there's no real recourse, and you always end up in a situation where, you know, benefits that are given out are always more generous than the city would like, and in most cases more than they can afford.
So it almost encourages the other side of the table not to come to an agreement.
Well, you know, again,
it's not always to their advantage to come to an agreement because they can get a better deal.
Exactly.
In arbitration.
And I think that it gets to a point where when you know that you can always fall back, it's kind of like having this safety net. You know, it's easy to walk across the high wire when you know that you've got a perfect safety net underneath you, and if you run into problems, you just fall back into the net and let the arbitrator decide it. And that's, I think, what hangs over all of the public safety negotiations, is that there's always this knowledge on the municipal side and the union side that if it doesn't work here, we can just go to arbitration. And I think that it forces cities to be a little more generous than they normally would, because they know that if they don't do it, if they can't get the agreement at the table, it's going to an arbitrator that's going to give them that and more. So it does make it very difficult for cities and towns to really rein in spending. And we always need to understand that for every benefit that's given, there's a cost that's associated with it, and there's a tax that has to go along with that
cost
to pay
to the
for
taxpayers. Sure.
And Woonsocket and every other city in town are living, breathing examples of taxation that's gone awry. And I think Rhode Island, when you look at the property taxes, Rhode Island as a state is near the tops in the nation for property taxes, and cities and most of your urban centers are near the tops in the state. So it's hurting the cities and towns, and mostly the urbans even more so. But it's,
you know, it's funny. I've always said, if you're, you know, the first in the state, and I think Woonsocket might be the first in the state for property taxes. It was in that Go Local Prov
yeah,
thing.
no, we are now.
So
yeah.
you're if the first in the state, in the fourth highest taxed state in the union, That means you're really up way over everybody else in the United States, not just in Rhode
Absolutely.
Island.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what makes it worse is that most of that money is not being spent on services that benefit the residents.
Yeah.
It's not as if you have the best streets in these cities
Roads,
and towns,
repairing buildings.
buildings. We're always cutting staff. We're always making do with what we've got. And so for that amount of tax effort that these cities like Woonsocket are putting in, they don't always see the benefits, because the benefits are being paid through the contracts to
Sure.
retirees and to employees. So that's what makes it a very difficult situation for cities and towns, when you know that every step you take in negotiations is always clouded by this knowledge that
There's
an
a threat
arbitrator
there.
that is going to come down and put the hammer, and I think that's what makes it more difficult.
Now, the process sounds reasonable, right? You get 3 arbitrators. One is chosen by the union, one by the town, and then a third one.
And then
Is
you
that
agree,
right?
and well, every city and town, I'm sure that different contracts have different processes, but it gets to a point where you each submit your request for who you would like, and then there's a neutral person that comes in. But that when you get to picking
Why doesn't that work?
When you get to picking those neutral people are basically, they're normally attorneys that put themselves in the position of being hired out as arbitrators. And I, as far as I have seen, I think that they know that their bread and butter is going to be to make sure that they continue to get hired, and they know that the unions are always going to be there. I, as a mayor, or whoever is sitting there as a mayor across the table, is probably going to be gone in a few years, so they don't need to really
So
go
for
along.
continued employment,
Correct,
they
it's
go
not-
with the union, because
That's
you could be a mayor today and not next time.
exactly, and I'm sure that you'll have 100 arbitrators say that's absolutely not the case. We are completely neutral, and none of that plays into it. But I think if you look at the history of it, you'll see that that's what I say is probably more accurate than not. So it does, and so the process sounds like it makes sense, but when you throw that compulsory nature to it and that binding ruling at the end of it, that's what makes all the difference. Arbitration in general, as far as a process or mediation of these types, works in many of the other circumstances, but when you look
But when
at
it's compulsory, it's more of a stick against...
it changes the nature of negotiations completely.
All right. And so do you think then that because of compulsory arbitration, binding arbitration, that unions have been less willing to come to agreements in the first round of negotiations? They are kind of stretched on because they know they had the upper hand?
Yes, I
Is that
do.
your feeling?
Yes,
Yeah.
and not only that, but I think that it leads them to come to the table with bigger requests. Because let's face it, when you get to an arbitrator, they're going to, in a sense of trying to be fair, they're going to take the offer from the union, they're going to take the offer from the city, and then they're going to come in and try to split it down the middle. So what
At
ends up-
least to look impartial.
Exactly. So if you're coming in from the union side, knowing that you've got this guy that's going to most likely give you half of whatever you ask for, the city's, in most cases, you can only ask for zero. Or you can ask for concessions giving back, but for the most part, when you start from zero and they're asking for something that's double what they really want, they know that they're going to get somewhere in the middle. And as such, it does make it for very difficult process and costly. That's the biggest issue, is that cities and towns should have the management ability to negotiate freely with their bargaining units without the threat of a state law that already binds cities and towns in so many other ways. Why does the state need to force that upon cities and towns? And it's difficult because as mayors, you try to forge great relationships, and I had great relationships. We have a great police department, we have a great fire department, and I was put in a position coming into a very bad situation where I was immediately asking them not only to give concessions, but to open their contracts, open existing contracts to give concessions, and to their credit, they did. So it's hard for me to have a personal gripe against our
Your
own
local,
union,
sure.
because they really stepped up to the plate and helped out. But when it comes right down to it, that same logic applies to every other city and town. And unfortunately, the arbitration, it also comes down to other situations, whether it be grievance proceedings or things of that nature.
Sure.
So it does make it all the more difficult for cities and towns and for mayors to be able to fully administer their budgets and to serve the taxpayers.
Okay. Well, that's a mouthful, and it's a real worry for taxpayers.
Absolutely.
But we're going to continue this discussion, and we'll be right back.
As Providence teeters on the verge of bankruptcy, the Senate takes action by transferring major operating costs over to the state. Are you kidding me? Municipal governments and even our state government are suffering from extended neglect of infrastructure. Politicians have long opted for the false economies of putting off for today what they can ignore till tomorrow. So it is with the maintenance and upkeep of streets in the capital city. One answer to relieving the crushing costs of playing catch-up after years of neglect has been proposed by Rhode Island Senators Pichardo, Goodwin, Ruggiero, Golden, and Miller. Their proposed legislation, Senate Bill 842, would simply designate certain streets in Providence as state highways. In fact, this bill proposes that redesignation for 79 streets, squares, or plazas in the city. That means the cost for rebuilding all of them, no matter how much they've grown over years of neglect, immediately falls to the state budget. That budget, too, is already in unsupportable deficit, by the way. To make things even better for Providence, the maintenance costs include those for plowing and snow removal for both the roadways and their sidewalks. Or, to put it another way, our Senate proposes to rob Peter, to pay Paul, and then immediately take credit for easing the capital city's financial woes. It won't work, but when has that ever stopped short-sighted politicians? Are you kidding me?
Hi, my name is Brandon Bell, Chairman of the Rhode Island Republican Party. For me, the recent very close special election made me energized, inspired, and optimistic about our future. The Rhode Island Republican Party is united. We teamed up from across the state with a message that we are no longer fragmented. We stood together in an unprecedented effort to get a quality Republican elected to the General Assembly. We engaged in an organized get-out-the-vote effort. We organized a ground game like I've never seen that had us working to get our voters out until the minutes the polls closed. Now that we are together, first, people will understand us better and join us if they fully understand why we believe what we do. Second, people will vote for us if we can define why we do what we do. And lastly, people will respond and want to be a part of what we believe if we define ourselves and not let others define us. What we do simply serves as the proof of what we believe. Spread the message that there is only one option for those who seek balance, responsibility, honesty, and civility in the state of Rhode Island. Step up and join the fight. You can find us on Facebook at Rhode Island Republican Party or email me directly at bbell@rigop.org. Thank you, and God bless.
Welcome back. I'm sitting here with Leo Fontaine, former mayor of Woonsocket, and we're talking about compulsory arbitration and how it really hurts taxpayers. The ability of a town's elected officials to control spending.
Sure.
Leo, you were mentioning kind of how your experience had been with it over time. You were a city council president for a long time.
Sure.
And you were always trying to rein in spending, and we're having a hard time in a lot because of compulsory arbitration. So tell our viewers, how has it affected Woonsocket? You're a city that's been in distress quite a bit.
Absolutely. It's really, when you look at the financial condition of Woonsocket, or really any city in town, you have to look long term, because it's a buildup from one year to another and from one contract to another. And historically, you would never see contracts benefits rolling back. There would always be increases.
Right.
And that's when you start looking at those decisions over the history of contracts. And that's one of the things that I had done as coming into mayor. When I was going to the unions asking for concessions, I was trying to lay out all of the increases that they had gotten over the years to put them into perspective. And when we saw some of the dramatic increases that were given, whether it be in health insurance, whether it be longevity payments,
different benefits,
literally, public safety unions, longevity, depending on what level of service, they were getting upwards into the double digits for longevity bonuses. So when you're sitting there and saying that for these employees that, and in some cases, the majority of the employees had been in for that period of time. So you're talking 13, 14% raises or longevity bonuses.
Yeah, let me just explain what a longevity bonus is to the folks out there, because longevity is often also included in the pension.
Correct.
It is just as you hit an anniversary date of your employment with your town or city, you get a check.
Absolutely.
It's a one-time lump sum check. It's called a longevity bonus, and it's just for lasting that long. It's not a promotion. It's not a real bonus check. It's not merit driven. It's just you've lasted that long. We actually stopped giving longevity bonuses at the state level because we couldn't afford it. But cities and towns are still using them in large measure.
Well, we have compulsory arbitration.
Because you have compulsory arbitration. There you go. And you're right. They can start at, 3, 4, 5% a year for the early years and go up to 10, 14, 16%.
Correct.
That's a big check.
It is.
A big check.
And it's a dollar amount that we have to calculate every year. We have to look at where everybody's going to be falling that year. And then we need to budget that full dollar amount, because when those bonuses are due, we cut those checks out, and it's a very difficult situation. And
then it also, as I alluded to, adds to the pension problem.
Correct.
Because it's not just the base wages, it's also longevity that are folded into the pension.
Correct.
Right.
And the thing is make no mistake that when negotiations are taking place, that comes into the discussion. The bargaining units know, and they will ask for things that are going to be included in pension calculations. So, and it becomes a bargaining chip that, well, if we give up this, will you give us extra here, because we know that that's going to go into our pension amounts. So it makes it all the more difficult. And when you look at some of the benefits that have been given over the years in Woonsocket, again, the majority of the most lucrative benefits have been the result of binding arbitration decisions. And some of the things that are in the contracts, and I don't have the contracts here, and I don't want to speak to the very specifics of when they were put in place, but for example, in our police contract, we actually had a benefit that offered a type of health insurance, and it was a plan, Classic Blue. It was a specific plan called Classic Blue. Blue Cross didn't even offer Classic Blue anymore. But because our contract said that they offered Classic Blue, we basically had to get Blue Cross to offer this separate package that we were...
even more expensive if they have to...
It was outrageous, and we had tried to finally to get that taken out of the contract, and we couldn't. And granted, it finally got to a point where when we ended up under the Fiscal Stability Act, everything was on the table, and things like that started. We forced everybody onto basically a standard health plan. But it was so difficult over all those years, literally 20, 30 years of offering a plan that was outrageously expensive, but we knew that we couldn't take it away because we'd never get it out through a binding arbitration decision.
And that's a Cadillac plan, the Classic Blue,
Absolutely.
That most of the folks out here don't get.
Correct.
Right? That's why it had to be specifically tailored to Woonsocket, because nobody else gets it.
Correct.
So was it a Maserati or just a Cadillac?
No, I think it was both. It was a Maserati with a spare Cadillac in the garage too. But that's one of the examples of how those decisions can be forced upon cities and towns, and they stay for decades. And that is the biggest issue, and why the state would feel the need to force this upon cities and towns it's outrageous. I mean,
it's one of those unfunded mandates we always talk about, and the people say, well, what is that? Well, this is one.
It is, and it's
an expensive one.
It's an extremely expensive one, but it's a difficult one to explain to people, because when you first tell them, well, an arbitrator's decision, it's this neutral person that's chosen by both sides.
It seems fair.
It sounds like the best process in the world.
But it isn't.
But it's really not, and it's very difficult, and it forces cities to be put to making decisions that are probably not in the best interest of the taxpayers long run.
Well, it has certainly caused some problems for Woonsocket, and you alluded to it. You have been under the management of the Fiscal Stability Act for 3 or 4 years.
3 years, yeah, 2012.
3 years.
It was.
And that was because it got to the point where you were having a hard time paying the bills?
Yeah, we got to a point where, through all of these decisions, Woonsocket we were doing well for a number of years, but Woonsocket, as an urban community that has to shoulder a lot of the burdens that other communities don't, we have a very high special ed percentage in our schools, very expensive school system, and over the years we got to a point of having these bills that added up. And when the state started cutting money to balance their own budget, that was really the straw that broke the camel's back and pushed us over the edge into the Fiscal Stability Act.
And so, under the Fiscal Stability Act, you had a hard time just paying your regular bills. You certainly were looking at your pension plan being in poorly funded yep. category. What has been the result to the property owners, your homeowners there?
Property taxes, we were forced basically to issue a supplemental tax.
How much was that?
It was about 23%.
23% more, okay.
And that gets added into the base, so that now every bill that gets, and the taxes have gone up every year since then.
So it wasn't just a supplemental, it was actually an increase.
It was added onto the base, correct. And that's unfortunately the burden that the taxpayers of Woonsocket are going to carry for quite some time.
Okay, and then in addition to that, didn't you have a homeowner's exemption for the elderly? Didn't that go away?
Well, we have a homestead exemption. That was reduced. That was one of the things that, as you know, on my time as a member of the Budget Commission, that was there. We and myself and the Council President, John Ward, fought the reduction. They wanted to eliminate the homestead exemption altogether, and we fought that. It was reduced a little bit, but not taken away altogether.
Not taken away. Good. And then you've had yearly increases almost at the max.
Yeah, and the new mayor just proposed a budget that brought up the levy almost to the max. The council, to their credit, did a lot of work and cut that back down to about 1.75% increase on the levy.
A little bit of relief, but after 3 years of really onerous increases,
absolutely, it's still
needed.
It really is.
All right, well, that's not good for Woonsocket. We'll go on to the other cities and towns, and we'll be right back.
RICO charges for using our First Amendment rights to free speech, and Senator Whitehouse wants you and me to forget about it. Are you kidding me? Senator Whitehouse, you swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Forget about it. A few weeks ago, you suggested in the Washington Post that we should be using the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, aka RICO, designed to put mob bosses behind bars against big oil companies who oppose your viewpoint on global warming or climate change, or whatever you're calling it this week. What? You see, Senator, opposing your point of view is okay and is protected under the First Amendment of that Constitution we're talking about. You know, that thingy you're supposed to support and defend. Forget about it. You hold a very high office, Senator, and we expect you to keep our rights in mind at all times. To threaten anyone with jail time for opposing your position on anything sounds eerily familiar to that King George guy we threw out of here 239 years ago. The good news for everyone is that we can simply vote against you in 2018. We don't have to have a revolution to get rid of you. Let's see how you handle yourself between now and 2018. Are you kidding me?
Welcome back. We're having the discussion today about compulsory arbitration with former Mayor of Woonsocket, Leo Fontaine, and we were talking about some of the bad effects that compulsory arbitration has had on the people of Woonsocket, your taxpayers, your homeowners. And one of those was because it drove your spending levels so high, higher than the people could afford to pay, you actually got to a point where you were struggling to pay the bills.
Correct.
And we have this wonderful act that the legislature, another unfunded mandate that the legislature passed called the Fiscal Stability Act. And so you have been under the control of the Fiscal Stability Act for 3 years.
Correct.
Tell me how that has developed in Woonsocket. What has been your experience with it? How has it affected people?
Well, probably just to put a little historical perspective, when back in 2007, I would say, is really the first year that the state really started rolling back a lot of the aid to cities and towns, whether it be through general revenue sharing, education funding. Woonsocket was hit dramatically with that, and I actually did a calculation. I did a calculation that took the cumulative effect of how much we lost over that period of time. And I was using this during the campaign, which obviously didn't resonate with people. But we lost $55 million over that period of time, and for a city the size of Woonsocket, that's not an easy amount to absorb.
What's your budget in Woonsocket?
About $130 million.
So half of your budget?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we got to a point where when I came in as mayor, I was already facing a very difficult situation. So we started consolidating departments, and I would put our operation against pretty much any budget in the state when it comes, and actually the country for that matter, as far as our ability to make do with very little. We consolidated entire departments. I gave up director positions and I merged the positions. Our police and fire departments were running short. We were operating short in our highway departments. We consolidated there. We did so many things to try to live within our means. But as the cuts continued to build, it just became unbearable, and we were so just really riding close to the edge of insolvency. And what ended up happening is our school department, which again, because of state law or another mandate that says that city and towns have really no say over the school budgets, the school department went and ran a huge deficit. We really couldn't even do anything to try to take control of it. A superintendent ended up leaving, the business manager ended up leaving only after finding out that there was another $10 million deficit on the school department side that we ended up, once that deficit hit, the city, it was on our backs to cover it, and that's what prompted the state to come in and implement the Fiscal Stability Act. We had been working with the state prior to that to try to get things in order after I came into office as mayor. But once the bigger deficit hit from the school department, there was no ability to avoid it. We needed some of the ability to get advances of state aid for education to pay the bills, and the only means was to fall under the realm of this Fiscal Stability Act.
So the Fiscal Stability Act works at the city side and the school side?
The Budget Commission, basically the first step of a Fiscal Stability Act is you have an overseer, basically somebody that just comes in and kind of keeps an eye on things. We went right to the second step, which was the full-fledged Budget Commission, which is a 5-member panel, 3 appointed by the state, 1 being the elected mayor or administrator, and 1 the town council president or city council president. And the Budget Commission basically comes in and takes full control of the city budget. They have all final say, whether it be administrative decisions or financial decisions, and that is
so even the elected officials are outnumbered on that mixture.
They absolutely are, and for the most part, for what little say elected officials have during that period of time, the final say comes from the state, and it got to a point where the state came in, and it's very hard going to the taxpayer saying that you're fighting for them, and at the same point have somebody from the state making the final decision saying, they don't really care what the taxes are, they just want it to be stable. And it made for a very difficult process, and I think
do they cut spending, or what was your... you had already trimmed a lot.
We did
yourself.
An awful lot, and I think if you were to speak to Rosemary Booth globally, I think that she would tell you that she was very surprised at how lean our budgets were. I think that they came into Woonsocket, as they had with some other communities, thinking that they were going to find enormous amounts of waste, that they were going to be able to cut here, cut there, and then solve the problems. And they came in realizing that they were not those pockets of money that other communities had. And so it really forced the Budget Commission into a very difficult position. I would venture to say, if you look now at the budgets, the budget now is much higher than what it was when I first came in as mayor. I think that they've added a lot of cost into the budget, and the new mayor has continued that spending process.
Well, you have gotten tax increases. The property owners in Woonsocket have gotten
They've paid
considerable.
For it.
So we were talking about that before. You got a supplemental tax of 23%?
Correct.
Oh my God, it's
enormous.
That's a hard one to chew on, quite frankly.
And quite honestly, it was a result of a long process and a lot of money that was cut from the state. And when it came right down to it, because of the position that we were placed in, the bond rating agencies came in and cut our bond rating, which froze us out of the credit markets to be able to refinance our debt. There were a lot of things that came into play that really forced the city into a bad situation, and I think a lot of it could have been avoided if the state would have had a better process, first of all, not forcing cities and towns into the position in the first place. But the Fiscal Stability Act, I think, turned out to be a pretty poor process. And I think that's why you're seeing the current governor hesitant to use it, because I think that most people would agree that there are circumstances happening right now that are worse than what Woonsocket was going through, but yet you see no movement to put them into a budget commission status.
And I know that the supplemental tax, which is, I think, poorly named because it wasn't supplemental, it was a tax increase, right, actually was voted on down in the General Assembly.
It was.
I don't think, right, I mean, I guess that's what the Budget Commission goes to the legislature and says, give this to the people of Woonsocket.
Well, any city or town, if ever you're in a position of needing to implement a supplemental tax, whether you're under a Budget Commission process or not, you need to go to the General Assembly. So we were in a position that because the Budget Commission was in place, it was the Budget Commission asking for the increase.
Yeah, and I know your three legislators, who was it? Was Representative Baldelli Hutt, Brien, and Phillips, I think.
Correct.
They were all advocating for that supplemental tax down on the...
Well, it was interesting. The first time that we proposed the supplemental tax, which I think would have solved a lot of the problem earlier, it actually ended up getting stalled up. Representative Baldelli Hunt ended up recommitting it, and it stalled. And as such, it ended up going into the next year, which only compounded the problems even more. And then that following year, we were still pushing for the supplemental tax. It was still necessary. And she basically took the plan that we had proposed and renegotiated it all and imposed and got voted the plan that she had put forth.
And it ended up costing more.
Correct.
Well, I have a lot of sympathy for the people in Woonsocket, I'll be honest with you, because, you know, as you know, I've been trying to fight property taxes for a long, long time in my communities, and the increases that I've seen them sustain has been enormous.
It is. And
very hard when you think of folks who might be on Social Security. They're struggling with low income anyway, and it's pretty much fixed there. So really hard. But let's tie this back to the compulsory arbitration. That's kind of what started the ball rolling. That's what ended up making those costs that you couldn't afford to begin with.
In essence, you know, as a mayor or a town administrator, you're faced with the juggling act of juggling, you know, whether it be personnel matters, financial matters, your roads, your public safety, all of these things as an administrator you need to deal with. And what ends up happening is you have the state legislature that comes in, and our legislators go up to Providence, and I think many of them forget the towns and cities that they came from, and they don't know what's happening in the cities and towns, and they enact these mandates upon cities and towns that basically take the balls out of the hands of the cities and towns and force them into a situation that's more difficult than it should be.
Yeah, I don't think they investigate what the long-term effect is going to be. And for Woonsocket, it's been pretty bad.
It's been very bad.
Yeah. All right, well, we'll be right back.
The House proposes arbitrary increases in business costs, just like those the governor tried. Are you kidding me? Recently, when rookie governor Gina Raimondo floated the idea of imposing transit tolls on truckers, everybody seemed to get it that this was a bad idea. Amateur economists from all over the Ocean State made the arguments that the added costs would simply be passed on to consumers. Milton Friedman acolytes from all walks of life also pointed out that the forced increase in costs would also force some firms to avoid doing business here or even closing up altogether. I guess not everyone got it, though. Representatives Bennett, McNamara, Lima, Hull, and McLaughlin went ahead and submitted legislation to raise the Rhode Island minimum wage again. The bill is House 5074, Substitute A. Its passage would mark the 9th time since 1999 that the state minimum wage has been increased. The minimum wage is a floor, not a ceiling. Working for the minimum wage is most often a temporary matter while a new employee proves himself or herself and begins to climb the wage ladder. All the arguments against tolling truckers also apply to raising the minimum wage, but there's one more argument that may be the real reason this group of reps has such an interest in raising annual base pay on the bottom rung from its current $18,720 per year to $19,968. That's because contracts for public service unions agreed by the state and all 39 municipalities stipulate base pay for workers as a percentage of the minimum wage. When the minimum wage goes up, so does the pay of government workers, and their raise is a lot more than 60 cents per hour that's proposed here. So this unfunded state mandate will hit you in the cost of a burger at McDonald's and in the cost of your rent or property taxes wherever you live in Rhode Island. Are you kidding me?
Welcome back. We're sitting here with former Mayor Leo Fontaine from the great city of Woonsocket, kind of the hurting city of Woonsocket right now. And we've been talking about compulsory arbitration and some of the things that really put taxpayers at a disadvantage because it is a mandate from the state. Leo, you've talked a lot about Woonsocket, and I think the folks understand that it has caused a lot of problems for you. But I know that as mayor, you talked with other mayors and town administrators. So is it restricted to Woonsocket, the problems?
No, and one of the things I think it's important, because I know that we have this show that we're focusing on this one issue, and I don't want anybody to think that I or any mayor is saying that compulsory arbitration is the one problem that's causing all of this. This is just one more on a pile of bad laws and bad decisions from the state that's forced upon cities and towns.
Those unfunded mandates we talked
and
about.
so it's really only one of the issues, but it's a big one. And as a mayor or town administrator, we have to fight every one of them. And so when I became mayor back in 2009, I began talking, and we actually had a great relationship between all of the mayors and town administrators across the state, and would meet on a regular basis and talked about a lot of the troubles, and compulsory arbitration or binding arbitration is one of those things that we saw and talked about as this kind of overhanging and always there type of problem that influences so much in what cities and towns do. And it really came to a head, I think, when there started to be discussion about trying to expand compulsory arbitration to the teachers' unions. And right now it's limited to public safety unions. And when that proposal was put forth, it galvanizes the mayors and administrators even more to fight it, because every city and town, as different as we may be, as Woonsocket may be different from a Barrington or a Warren, we have a lot of the same issues.
Yeah.
And
you're always trying to control spending.
it is, and especially when you get into a fire situation. Fire was probably one of the more difficult unions for me to deal with, because I think if you look...
I can believe that.
Yeah. I think if you look at their operation, I would say that a higher percentage of what they do is mandated by state law. Throughout their entire contract, there were so many things that if they didn't get it at the bargaining table, they ran to their friends in the legislature and they got the laws passed, because you end up with a lot of people that are friendly to the fire unions. Here in Woonsocket alone, 2 of our members are firefighters.
That's right. Representative Casey and Moran are both
correct.
firefighters.
So Representative Moran was the president of the union not long before he became a state rep. He was across the negotiating table with me. So those things that they couldn't get at the table, they over the years ran to the state to get the legislature.
I've noticed that.
And they've tried it again this year. Unfortunately, it looks like it's not working. But we got to situations where I just didn't have the money in the budget to cover overtime costs and things. I was trying to reduce using one ladder truck. I got to a point where I said, if we reach a certain level of staffing that we don't have enough people to cover the trucks, instead of bringing in even more people on overtime, I'm just going to brown out one of the ladder trucks, and we're going to make do with the other ladder truck. They had signs, trucks driving around with signs on it, call the mayor and tell him that he's placing your life in danger, and these sorts of things are probably similar to what many cities and towns are facing. And we went through the process of trying to implement the 3-platoon system that is now, North Kingstown was finally the first to get the decision.
But it had to go 3 years into the Supreme Court.
It was, and we were on the same path as they were, but fortunately we were able to negotiate a solution that we implemented 24-hour platoons without having to go to a 3-platoon system, and there were a number of other givebacks. But it gets to a point where all the cities and towns face many of the same problems, and I think that we're all fighting to try to push back some of these mandates that the state has forced on all of us.
And this has been a real damaging mandate, and I can see
over
that.
the years, absolutely.
In Coventry, one of my towns, they actually have a pension plan that covers the police, and it was 9% funded. I think it's 11% funded now. It's a pension plan. Well, you've been there.
Yeah.
You know that when it's that, I'm a financial advisor, when something is that lowly funded or that poorly funded, it's almost impossible to restore it. Even if you got 100%, you'd only be at 22%, right? Because of the threat.
To play devil's advocate there, the unions would say, well, that's the city and town's fault for not funding it appropriately. And to some degree, they're right. But mayors and administrators are forced, because of all of the other costs in their budgets, they're forced to say, well, I either have to fund this or fund that. And unfortunately, contributions to the pension, to your required payment contributions each year, you figure, you know what, I'll make it next year. So I need to pay this increase, this raise that was negotiated. I need to pay that this year, and I don't have the money. So it forces city and towns into decisions that they probably wouldn't want to be. And I think now you're seeing in Providence very vividly that decisions were put off, and payments were not made. Not only were they not making the payments, but they were borrowing money from the fund, which is, I think, going to be a recipe for disaster.
It's disaster there, but I think it's disaster in my town of Coventry.
Every one of them.
Because and I talked with the town administrator after they signed this contract. They gave a 3% COLA to policemen, a COLA meaning a cost of living increase during retirement, because they said specifically we were afraid of going to compulsory arbitration.
Yeah.
So you've got a pension plan that is on the path to insolvency, and you made it worse because of compulsory arbitration.
Absolutely.
Just a bad mandate. It hurts. It hurts taxpayers. It hurts property owners. What's the alternative?
Well, I would venture to say that the alternative would be to do what every private business does and every private contract, that has any type of personnel type angle to it, is you implement as part of the contract either mediation or arbitrator's process that would allow a path, when you reach impasse on decisions, that would allow a path for an arbitrator or mediator to come in and try to work out those differences.
Help you split the baby?
Yeah, and I would say in most cases, non-public safety, whether you talk municipal unions, teachers unions, support personnel, whatever it may be, that process has worked in all the cities and towns for all these years. So I don't understand, one, why you need to have it within public safety. I think that the process could work just as well there. And more importantly, certainly I don't see the need to expand compulsory arbitration to other bargaining units.
So it has worked, though.
It absolutely has. I mean, you don't see, you'll hear the union say, well, if you don't have it, we're going to spend all our time in court. Well, you may end up in court once in a while, and that's part of the process. But you don't see cities and towns in court every day over municipal unions or over teachers' unions. You'll see a case periodically happen, and it happens no matter what. But
I think all the parties want to come to agreement. They don't want a rancorous relationship.
No, because I think for the most part, you get to a point where you all realize that you're on the same team. As much as you're trying to fight for your own advocacy groups, as it may be, I think that you all realize that if you're a teacher in the city of Woonsocket or Warwick or Providence, you work there. You've got to be there every day. And the long-term fiscal stability of whatever city or town you're in plays to your long-term fiscal stability, because if Woonsocket can succeed or any other city or town can succeed, it gives them the ability to be a more stable workplace for them in the long run.
Okay, so when we got to wrap it up now because we're out of time, but when they talk about expanding it to teachers' contracts, for you, pretty much a no.
Absolutely. I don't think that the state should be forcing anything else on cities and towns. The state has already really stuck it. I was going to use another word, but they really stuck it to the cities and towns.
I'm glad you didn't.
But they've already done it enough. I think that the state, the last thing that the General Assembly should be doing is adding more burdens on the cities and towns.
And I agree with you. So thank you so much for coming,
My pleasure.
Leo. I
My
really
pleasure.
appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Good luck to you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for listening.
I have been married to the same wonderful woman for 45 years. I can still remember quite vividly how we met, in a bar. It took all of 3 months to get married, and the rest is history. Seemed so easy then. Recalling the dating game in the 60s, we sometimes met in high school or college. We lived next door to each other. We met at the many local dances. We met at the grocery store. Our parents introduced us to the kids of their friends. We met at work. We had lots of opportunities to be around people our own age who were candidates for the electricity of love and marriage. When we did meet someone we really liked, we were willing to find a way to be with them wherever they happened to be. Might even cost a lot of money to take an airplane ride sometime. Well, it's different now. Now we look for people online. We can get dating assistance from dating sites and mobile apps. That would be applications. Seems there are 500 apps on Apple's iTunes. This is big business. The Wall Street Journal recently ran an article by Georgia Wells on June 11th, actually, on the subject of matchmaking game, the matchmaking game. The article makes the claim that the dating sites on the internet expect to make, oh, you'll love this, $1.17 billion this year. The dating apps expect to log in $628.8 million. Well, for me, these are extraordinary numbers, as I didn't have any help when I met my wife, and yet we met and married. I read the whole article to find out what I might be able to talk about should I encounter a bright, young, single American who might ask me how to find a mate. What do you have to do to meet someone, fall in love, get married, and start a family? Seems to me that is a social goal our country really needs to win so we can get on with life. You know, the birth rate has to exceed the death rate or it's over. Well, how can young people find each other in the world of iPhones? Now, the current numbers are 48.7% of them use online dating, 26.2% use mobile apps, 12.2% use matchmakers, 6.7% attend single events, and then there's the 4.2% who do it some other way. I guess those are the only choices these days. Now, don't suppose they meet in church anymore. The world of computer dating is quite sophisticated with lots of money at stake. Wall Street Journal articles spent a lot of word space talking about entrepreneurs willing to dump millions into new ways to introduce people to each other. And there are now ways for anyone with a particular passion to search the web world for someone who might be interested in meeting them. Seems every variation of human existence has a site. Are you looking for someone who is gluten-free? Got it. And the list goes on. If you can think of a category of human interest, there is a World Wide Web dating connection. Some of these sites don't charge anything initially. But to make the money the industry is making, there has to be a way to stay in business, profits. Of course, there are those that charge as much as $60 a month. They make millions of dollars doing what cost nothing to do in the 60s. Introduce people to each other. I remember my kids telling me that they entered all sorts of information into the sites they were using and went about sorting through people to find the right ones. It worked for one of my 3 married kids who found someone, thankfully. The other 2 did it the old-fashioned way. So I guess the new world of dating will carry on giving opportunities for people to meet wherever and whenever they currently live and work. Now, I wonder what I would have created as my dating profile way back when. Quote, useless male with little or no skills, willing to do almost anything to get out of Rhode Island so I can get a job. Find you and start a life of leisure. Please call 401-123-4567. I think I paid the phone bill last month. Well, maybe that wouldn't have gotten the right person's attention. I don't envy our kids today who have to sort through the labyrinth of computer dating information, but I don't think they have much of a choice. Log on or stay at home. Thanks for watching and God bless.
4 minutes and 54 seconds.
Yes.
What the hell?
Yes.
Hello, welcome to Common Sense. This is a program where we try to make sense out of the policies that affect your life.
Common Sense is on each week on Verizon Channel 34 or Cox Channel 15, Saturdays at 4 p.m., Sundays at 10 a.m. You can also find us online at www.commonsenseri.org. Join our host, Representative Patricia Morgan, each week as she brings you a variety of experts from the financial or small business community, government policy experts, town councilors, and members of our state General Assembly to discuss the issues that affect your life. We review the news of the week from our own perspective with Elizabeth Smith and Luis Vargas. We hear from Jeff Richard, who always brings us some interesting insight, and where we always ask the question, are you kidding me? So remember to join us on Verizon Channel 34 or Cox Channel 15, Saturdays at 4 p.m. and Sundays at 10 a.m., or online at www.commonsenseri.org, on Facebook and our YouTube channel, Common Sense, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter at CommonSenseRI.